Welcome to Honors World History. Today we're going to continue our far too brief and far too quick survey of all the Chinese dynasties prior to the Ming. So Tang, Song, and Yuan dynasties for today. So here's your basic objectives. Let's take a moment and dive in and just give a brief overview of what these dynasties did and how China changed during this time period. So the dynasty that we're not going to talk about that sort of disappears in our discussion of Chinese dynasties is the Sui dynasty. They have a lot of similarities with the Qin dynasty in that they did unify China after the period of the Three Kingdoms and the Northern and Southern period. The Sui dynasty took control through, military superiority. They did a lot of the things that the Qin dynasty did, forced conscription, rebuilding the Great Wall, sort of redredging the Grand Canal, connecting the country together. But because of their harsh rule, they were not super popular, and they're going to be overthrown by another dynasty that is going to be another one of the sort of golden ages in Chinese history. One of the things that the Sui dynasty was known for was, again, the conscription of people into these public works projects. And so the intentional maiming of people in order to avoid military and civil conscription was common throughout the Sui dynasty. And as most of these sort of tyrannical dynasties that rely on legalism do, they were eventually overthrown by a general who took over in order to, get rid of the tyranny of the Sui dynasty, and then was eventually overthrown by another house, specifically the Duke of Tang, who then became Emperor Gaozhou, who started this new dynasty. Emperor Gaozhou was mostly successful because of his prodigy son, Li Shimin, who was brilliant at a lot of different things. He was a great warrior. He was especially a really good cavalry officer leading cavalry charges. He was incredibly smart and savvy and all of these things. And so he helped propel his father to the throne, who would overthrow the general who overthrew the Sui dynasty and declare this new dynasty the Tang dynasty. You can see that the Tang dynasty is going to take over pretty much the territory of the Sui dynasty, and then eventually is going to extend westward, sort of reopening all these trade routes. And Li Shimin is eventually going to become probably the greatest empire that the Tang dynasty is going to see. He was set up by a couple of his brothers in what's called the incident at the Zhanwu Gate, where an ambush was established, and he ended up killing both of his brothers with really well-placed arrows. And then his father abdicated to make him emperor of all of China. And so Li Shimin is going to become Tang Taizong, becoming the most successful emperor of the early Tang dynasty. Here's Taizong laying out how an emperor should behave. So take a moment, pause, and read. Hopefully we can see some elements of Confucianism here and just a level of self-awareness from Taizong about sort of the isolation of the palace and how emperors should behave because of that. The Tang dynasty is most known for being sort of the military peak of sort of these early Chinese dynasties. Incorporating in new armor, Tang Taizong is going to lead a series of expeditions against the sort of Western steppe peoples. He's also going to reform the military and incorporate in a whole bunch of different skills, making the Tang dynasty military sort of similar to the Romans in some ways, in which Chinese soldiers in this era became sort of dukes of all trades, being able to farm, being able to build, being able to especially, support themselves. And so that's going to lead the Tang dynasty to be able to go on sort of long military expeditions successfully. And they're going to incorporate in gunpowder and rockets into their military, allowing them again to push westward and help connect China to, Eurasia and the Mediterranean world during the Tang dynasty. This golden age brings tons of wealth and prestige into China. We get the growth of spices, and in China, we get a return of the imperial examination system, this Mandarin system, and the reestablishment of effective Chinese bureaucracy. We get the creation of movable type printing during the Tang dynasty, which increases Chinese literature. We get the growth of terracing, making more of the land fertile. And especially, we get the growth of this tribute system. The Tang dynasty is really the beginnings of this Chinese tribute system that's going to be relevant to our discussion of China all the way until the collapse of the Qing dynasty and the century of dishonor. The tribute system is the idea that, again, the Chinese see themselves as the center of the world, the Middle Kingdom, and that they are the universal empire sort of over everybody. All other kings then owe some measure of tribute to the Chinese emperor, and they then give these gifts to the Chinese emperor in tribute in exchange for trade with China. And so trade with China was never really about generating wealth for China. Of course, Confucianism puts merchants at sort of the bottom of the social pyramid. But what it was about is establishing Chinese authority over everyone else. And so China became this leading empire in Asia, not because they actually ruled over Korea or Japan or Tibet or any of these other states, but because they provided tribute to the Chinese emperor and thus were allowed to trade with China for all the wonderful goods that the Chinese had. This is going to continue through all other Chinese dynasties from here on out, but it establishes sort of the position of China in the world, for the Chinese at least. We're also going to see a return of Confucian values. One of the first versions of the story, the ballad, the story of Mulan, was from the Tang Dynasty. So here's just a brief excerpt of this. Hopefully, you can see Confucian values in here and Confucian values in Mulan in general. We also see the rise of Taoism during this time period, this idea that the world is in general balanced and that fighting against human nature and fighting against the world is, useless and is not a path to success. Taoism is a really complicated religion, so we're not going to really get into this whole deal here, but we do have the story of the Taoist farmer. So take a moment, pause, and read. Hopefully you can see how this sort of emphasizes the unknown of the future, and the idea that like trying to focus on what's going to happen next is, or control is going to happen next, is somewhat pointless. We also see this through stories like Kung Fu Panda. I'm not going to show this for this video, but if you've seen Kung Fu Panda, there's elements of Taoism, elements of Buddhism within all of this philosophy. Buddhism comes to China during this time period as well. The teachings of the Buddha, we talked about this previously when we were talking about South Asia, but it's the acceptance of impermanence, the acknowledgement that disconnecting yourself from sort of the material world is the path to happiness and enlightenment. This is going to come to China during this time period and become relatively popular amongst Chinese elites, and then, of course, from there spread to other places in Southeast Asia. So here's the basic teachings of Buddhism. This is also going to become central to China going forward. Tang Taizong dies, and his empress, or his favorite wife, Empress Wu, is going to more or less take over China and rule as first a shadow empress, and then, or the empress dowager, and then eventually empress in her own right, declaring a new dynasty. She is the only woman to officially rule China, and so Confucian scholars have been relatively mean to her over the course of writings of Chinese history. And so, in the end, the jury is out to some extent on whether or not Empress Wu was a good ruler. A lot of Confucians use her as an example of corruption, and especially in her later reign, there's certainly evidence to show that she didn't rule particularly well. But in her early years, she was a pretty effective empress, and the Tang Dynasty did okay under her rule, at least until the end. After Empress Wu, you get a rebellion of a general named An Lushan. The An Lushan rebellion lasted for about a decade, led to the burning of Chang'an, the capital, and significant unrest throughout the Tang Dynasty. After the An Lushan rebellion, the Tang Dynasty is going to hang on for a while, similarly to the Han Dynasty, but it's going to lose significant power. The various states of China are going to get more autonomy. The centralized government of the Tang Dynasty is never going to again really control much of China. And eventually, the Tang Dynasty is going to collapse into oblivion, and we're going to have another period of disunity through. Eventually, the Song Dynasty and Emperor Taizhu are going to reunite the Middle Kingdom through military superiority and economic might. The Song Dynasty is noteworthy for being China's sort of height of economic power. New sort of nautical designs lead to Chinese ships being able to travel longer distances. We're going to see Chinese culture, civil service exams, porcelain, tea, all of these things spread to Southeast Asia, along with Buddhism and Taoism, Chinese art forms. All of this sort of stuff is going to spread to other places. Japan is going to model their society to some extent off of the Tang Dynasty and the sort of Chinese governmental system, although with some pretty clear differences, as you'll see when we get to Japan. And so this is when Chinese, the economy and the culture are at their sort of zenith here during this time period. We're going to see a focus again on poetry, on art, especially with natural themes. The Chinese are going to invent a game that's similar to soccer, which is going to become very popular. And, we're going to see technological growth during the Song Dynasty as well. And so the Song Dynasty is mostly known for those things and less known for their military prowess. Here's an example of a poem by the noted poet Du Fu. So you can see here the themes, nature, Confucianism, those types of things. The Song Dynasty militarily never had the cachet of the Tang Dynasty or the Ming Dynasty after it. They started to be displaced relatively early on by the Khitan Liao, a sort of nomadic steppe people who used the speed of their troops and their cavalry to take control of northern China. They eventually displaced the Song dynasty out of their capital of Kaifeng, where they had moved the capital after the repeated burning of Chang'an. The southern Song dynasty would continue for another 100 years, but this is the beginning of sort of steppe people dominance over China, which eventually is going to become more prominent with the whole Mongol invasion. Genghis Khan, of course, Temujin, took over a significant portion of the world during his lifetime. His sons continued on sort of the Khanates, and his grandson, Kublai Khan, finished the conquest of first the Khitan and then the Song dynasty itself. The Mongols established a massive dynasty and or control over China, declaring Kublai Khan the Great Khan, the son of heaven as well. The Yuan dynasty is the name of this sort of Mongol dynasty. And in a lot of ways, they adopted sort of Chinese practices. They also did the things that other Mongols did in that they brought in experts from other places into China in order to try to, help rule the Chinese people. They tried to expand the power of the Yuan dynasty by invading first Japan and then later sort of Java and some of the Indonesian islands. These failures and incredibly expensive military campaigns really weakened the power of the Yuan dynasty. And that, coupled with sort of the unrest from the Han Chinese from being kind of elbowed out of top civil service jobs, led to discontent against the Mongols and eventually rebellion. So that's going to take us through all the dynasties up to the Ming dynasty. So next time, we're going to slow down pretty significantly and talk about the rise of the Ming dynasty and their place in Chinese history. So thank you.